Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to this afternoon session. I really am very appreciative to Julie and My Jewish Learning for the opportunity to share with you some insights into Tisha B'Av and how it has current application for us in today's world, given current events, given current life experiences. I will also tell you that I'm deeply appreciative of My Jewish Learning on a personal level because I find that it's one of my reference guides. And I'm deeply appreciative that there's this wonderful compendium of thoughtful essays and scholarship that gives me an opportunity to find a grounding and then take off in whatever direction happens to be of particular interest to me. And matter of fact, in preparation for today's conversation, I went right to one of my favorite sources, My Jewish Learning, to see what other people who are scholars in the field had to share. And I actually came up with a couple of interesting takeaways that helped me hopefully articulate what we're going to do this afternoon. So with that, I am going to share my screen with you, and hopefully I'm always a little bit concerned about the original sound piece on this, so might have to play that by ear, but I will see how that works. Hopefully it will work reasonably well. And I will share the screen in just a moment. And let us begin. Tisha B'Av is one of those extraordinary holidays. It's, as you know, filled with a sense of overwhelming pain and grief, but it's actually far more than that. And I'm looking forward to spending some time with you this morning talking about those things.
Echa yashva vadad, hayira bat yam, hayta kyalmana, rabati bagoyim, sarati bamdinot, hayta lamas, pachot tivke balayla, vedimata alecheya, Ein la menachem mikol ahaveha koreha bagduva hayula leoivim galta yuda meoni umerov avuda hi ashva vagoyim.
Those are the first 3 verses of the 5 chapters that comprise Echa, which is translated here as alas, or maybe more appropriately, how, questioning how the fall of Jerusalem could possibly have happened. But I want to be able to understand Tisha B'Av also in the context of something broader and more powerful. That in the remembering of our past tragedies, we actually become empowered to create a more meaningful future. And this is one of the great, I believe, one of the great secrets that most of our rituals and traditions have. When we look at the compendium that is Jewish wisdom, by and large, I find that this basic understanding that the rituals that we use is all about how we can find ourselves and the fact that we are part of the ongoing humanity that continues to experience the trials and tribulations that all of us confront, and that these become opportunities for us to create wisdom for ourselves moving forward. Now, Tisha B'Av, technically, what is it? It's a commemoration of tragedies that befell the Jewish people. There are 7 that are commonly recognized. There are many, many more that have been ascribed to Tisha B'Av. First, of course, there were the very first one in our history is the 12 spies. Coming back from their scouting expedition, they return to Moses and the people, and you'll recall, basically come back with not such great news. The good news was the place is absolutely amazing. The bad news is there's no way that we can actually enter the land. That despite the promises, despite the fruit and the honey and the grapes the size of houses, the people are giants and we are but grasshoppers. Of course, the next tragedy that befell us, besides the betraying or not believing in God's word, is the destruction of the first temple. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, as everybody remembers, sacked Jerusalem and took us out and enslaved us, leaving a desolate, desolate place that was the seat of God's home here on earth. The second temple was another great tragedy where the Romans laid siege and destroyed the second temple, leading up then into the Bar Kokhba rebellion, where not only was the second temple and Jerusalem vanquished, but the Jews were essentially expelled from the land, never to come back until they did. Expulsion from England was the next thing that happened to us, moving up into the 13th century of the Common Era. The next one was the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Besides Columbus, we were given the opportunity to convert, leave or die. There was another expulsion, which isn't mentioned here, but also ascribed to Tisha B'Av, the expulsion from France. The next one, number 6 on this tragic cavalcade of events, is the beginning of World War I, that great tragedy that enveloped all of Europe and, of course, the world as we understood it. And certainly last but not least, Tisha B'Av is the time that we understand Treblinka begins its operations as an extermination camp, and the Warsaw Ghetto deportations also ensue. Very, very dark times in Jewish history, calamities of a nature that seemed overwhelming, completely and totally overwhelming.
Rabbi Levin,
yes.
Can you confirm the date of the destruction of the first temple? Because I think many people know the date as 586.
586 would be the date that most folks would use. There are some discrepancies depending on particular calendars that I've seen, but 586 is the date that's commonly used.
Thank you.
What did I have there?
Oh, you had 421.
Oh, well, sorry about that. I'm glad somebody proofed my slide. I do apologize for that. But yes, 586 is the date that we ascribed to. The breach of Jerusalem happened before that. The breach of the temple happened on Tisha B'Av. How do we observe? The expansion of Tisha B'Av happened and is a question that actually scholars and rabbis continue to debate. We actually begin, some of us who are particularly observant, 3 weeks beforehand. The night before, which would be coinciding with Friday evening this week, would be the meal before the fast, the Seudat HaMafseket, and that happens, again, that's the meal immediately before, and then we engage in a day of fasting along the lines and gravity of the fasting that we would share on Yom Kippur. We abstain from creature comforts. We don't wear shoes. In fact, bare feet might be encouraged. We don't wash. We abstain from physical relations. Anything that would bring creature comforts to us are things that we shun as a sign of the mourning. We're encouraged actually to visit cemeteries, which is different from other religious holiday observances. And there's a particular limitation on Torah study. Torah study is considered good for its own sake. It's considered one of the great joys of the Jewish people. And that's precisely why we're told where we should not be doing it. There are certain sections of Torah, such as the book of Job, such as Lamentations, are places where we can spend some time. But the traditional engagement of Torah study, Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake, is something too joyful. We also use Psalm 137, which is a great lament over the loss of Jerusalem and our challenge to try and continue to remember. And again, we read Echa, and we have Kinot, which are essentially dirges, which recall tragedies that happened along the way. Letters oftentimes, Simon Ibn Giberol is one who wrote some of the keynote that we read. Judah Halevi, another writer that we've used in order to try and understand what was going on in their hearts and minds. And I'm going to skip right into now what comes after. The thing that happens after Tisha B'Av is over, when we get up from those low stools upon which we sit, is called Shabbat Nachamu. It's based on the Haftorah reading of the time, which is from Isaiah. And you folks, I'm sure, are all familiar with it. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomer Elohechem. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. And then it continues on, Isaiah continues on to try and console the people, to speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and to declare to her that her term of service is over, that the iniquity has been expiated, for she has received at the hand of the Lord double for all of her sins. And that now becomes the precursor to the process and the preparation leading up to the month of Elul, which are the 30 days immediately preceding Rosh Hashanah, what we consider the core new year of the Jewish calendar. So these are the what it was and how we do it and what comes after. So this is what Tisha B'Av is happening to us. And I hope that you noticed in some of this stuff that there are similarities to other kinds of mourning. Shiva, Yartzeit, Yizkor, they're all kind of, you hear some rhythms and some rhymes going on in the practices. Shiva, of course, is that period of intense grief. We sit on low stools, just like we do for Tisha B'Av. We abstain from creature comforts, just as we do on Tisha B'Av. Yartzeit's the annual commemoration or anniversary of death. We remember our loved ones. And we also do it, we begin to do it in a slightly more communal setting, where we might go to synagogue for the Yartzeit, and we would go and recite Kaddish there with our community. Yizkor, similarly, 4 times a year, collective and communal gathering, where if you go to the high holidays, for example, there's a special Yizkor service, as there are for the other festival holidays that we observe. So 4 times a year, we get an opportunity to be with our fellows, this communal aspect to it. Now, one of the things that I find interesting and striking about things like Yizkor and Yartzeit relating to Tisha B'Av is that they're responses to major calamities. Tisha B'Av, of course, we focus on the destruction of the first and second temple. But Yizkor and Yartzeit, as most folks may not actually realize, aren't from Sinai. These are actually things that we've been doing in response to the tragedy and horrors that we found ourselves confronting in Europe, most notably the Crusades and the Black Death. So the Crusades, unfortunately, on their way to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels, the Crusaders unfortunately slaughtered tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews along the way. Part to as political, part as religious, part as just a very ugly understanding of what it was that was their mission. And the Black Death similarly was where there was this massive death on a huge scale. And Jews, in response to these calamities, needed a way to figure out, how do we process this incredible grief? How do we understand, like Tisha B'Av, that God still cares for us, that we can maybe find our way back to God? Not so much does a God who loves us, would a God who loves us do something as horrendous as this to us? But can we find our way back to a God who has visited this kind of punishment upon us for whatever ills we've committed? Remember, that's a very different mindset from, say, the modern approach, where we say that we don't often view God as serving and meting out punishments for bad behavior. I think the modern view of God is that God does not actually do things in quite that way, but the more traditional sensibilities said otherwise. Just as another nod to Tisha B'Av in terms of practices, the Chevra Kadisha that we embrace as part of and part and parcel of Jewish ritual at end of life, that is something that was borrowed by the Jews of Spain when they were exiled in 1492. This was done by Christian Brotherhood. And we took it with us. And that's how it ended up spreading into Europe and into Ashkenaz, because the Jews of Spain brought it with them both east and north, as they were forced to flee from Spain. So all of those things, all of those accountings continued to develop and evolve, and eventually became Kaddish, eventually became the Yizkor and Yahrzeit ceremonies. There's a reason why Yahrzeit is German, because it was developing and processing in an area that was primarily Germanic. So it makes sense from a historical perspective that these things were there. But it's fascinating to see that Judaism has continuously looked upon the tragedies as an opportunity not to deny them, but to figure out how to embrace them, grieve with them, grieve with others in this moment, and then figure out how to move on. What is it that we can learn from a collective experience? What can we learn from the personal issues of loss? Psalm 137, very familiar.
The waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember thee, Zion. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. We remember for thee, Zion. We remember waters for thee, Zion. We remember waters for thee, Zion. We remember waters for thee, Zion.
I need to take a moment. It's sad. It's deeply, deeply sad. Jerusalem was the center of our world. Jerusalem was the place where God actually chose to live among his people. And it was ripped away from us. And we were sold into bondage. Now what? Now what? The brilliance of Jewish wisdom is that we don't mire ourselves in this space. We figure out what to do with it. in some way, how do we return from exile becomes a central question that we need to confront. What is the exile that we're experiencing, and how do we get back from that to something better? We use our memory to recall and experience things, and we then try to figure out how do we apply it in our time. Because that idea of exile, if you take it as not a literal understanding of exile, but a metaphorical understanding of exile, we all find ourselves in that space, cut off either spiritually or emotionally or even physically from the things that we need in order to make us whole. But Judaism has consistently been working with this as a concept. It didn't take me very long to realize all of a sudden, as I was thinking about this, the story of Amalek. We're told to blot out the memory of Amalek, that guy who was picking off the frail and the vulnerable of the tribe of Israel as they were fleeing under the strong arm of God out of Egyptian bondage into freedom on their trek towards the promised land. And we were told we specifically remember Amalek, and we're supposed to blot out his memory at the same time. It's an interesting kind of attention. But what it does is it gives us an opportunity as moderns to say the oppression of the weak and the vulnerable becomes the call to protect the widow and the orphan. This is the brilliance of our capacity to reframe and find meaning even in the space of tragedy. The Exodus itself is the second example which comes to my mind. It's a tale of oppression, 400 years of slavery and bondage. But it becomes a story of liberation. And it's not a story of liberation just for us. Because we have taken this not only as a call for us to be free, but we are now committed to freedom everywhere. And I'm proud to say that our people understand that the American dream encompasses this concept of freedom for all, that none are free until all are free. And we are committed to that. And that comes from this horrible situation that we found ourselves in a couple thousand years ago. So our capacity to reimagine what could be is so important. The problem with forgetting, Americans love to deny stuff. As I said to Julie as we were preparing for this, I said, you know, Americans have this wonderful capacity to pretend that we're all 25 years old and everything's great. And anything that represents grief, we deny it. That's not healthy, that's not good. But the fact is that if we don't embrace our grief, that is more unhealthy. When we own the situation, not wallow in it, but if we own the situation, we have lessons that we can learn and we can grow from those lessons. And when we forget, frankly, we're just open to repeating the very same mistakes that got us to the place that was so hurtful and painful. For any of you that may have experienced the loss of parents, personal examples, the grief that we feel over the loss of a parent is profound, but we don't just say we are horribly grieving their loss. We say, Zichronam livracha, may their memories be for a blessing. It's an opportunity to take the best of them and carry them in our hearts and our minds, use the lessons that they've taught us. And that becomes the way that we remember them at their best, and hopefully helping us to become our best. This is the full Psalm 137, but the moving words of that round robin singing, I think, speaks or sings for itself. Rabbi Irving Greenberg, known as Yitz Greenberg, was one of the founding members of Klal, the Center for Learning and Leadership, of which I'm a rabbinic fellow and very proud to inherit that beautiful space. But he said something incredibly profound. The secret of Jewish survival has been the incredible capacity of Jews to use the memory of tragedy to spur themselves to come back again and again after defeat. We could have, and by a lot of other standards that we could measure against, we should have ended up on the dustbin of history thousands of years ago. Like when the first temple was destroyed, that should have been it. When the second temple was destroyed, that really should have been it. And yet, Yavna occurred. The state of Israel is an extraordinary example, and I won't engage in the discussion as to whether or not the state of Israel is a direct result of the Holocaust or not. That's not my purpose, but to be able to juxtapose the two and to say, out of the ashes, quite literally, out of the ashes of Europe, the third commonwealth of the Jewish people exists, is this miracle, is this ongoing ability to push ourselves forward, to learn from the past and grow from it and create something even better and more special. Julie mentioned that I am an author of Jewish End of Life in a Virtual Age, Our Traditions Reimagined. This was the kind of challenge that we thought about when it came time to applying this kind of wisdom to the pandemic. And really what we found was some wonderful things that came out of our capacity to reimagine our rituals, to re-engage ourselves, to not just sit in the dark corner and wait for the pandemic to pass. Jewish traditions, my Jewish learning, had an explosion of stuff that came online. We all experienced this treasure trove of ways to connect that we hadn't seen before. So what we did essentially, and what we continue to do, is because we were denied the physical presence, we reimagined what rituals could be based on underlying purpose. So in other words, you sort of deconstruct the ritual that we have, assuming that the ritual is meant to actually convey something important, which I think is a reasonable assumption for us to say when it comes to our rituals. But go to the core value by deconstructing that ritual. Figure out what that core value is, and then begin to rebuild and reconstruct that ritual, sensitive to both the history as well as the current sensitivities that we're experiencing. So for example, two things that come out of this book, which I think were really important, just by way of example, chaplaincy. Well, you couldn't see each other. In the beginning of the pandemic, we all saw those pictures of people waving in windows if they could even get near the hospital, people dying alone, people grieving the folks that they've lost alone, unable to have those final moments together. What became extraordinary was that we had a situation where we reimagined what the chaplain could do. And some of our extraordinary chaplains, one of whom wrote for us an essay in the book on this, was really about becoming a conduit. What she did was she interposed herself at the hospital. She would reach in to the, or at least through the room. She would be talking to the doctor. She would be engaging with the patient to the extent that it was possible, and then turning around and going back to the families and creating the bridge so that the people wouldn't feel alone. She would be shuttling her iPad back and forth, sometimes handing the iPad to the caregiver, the nurse, or the doctor, who would then bring it over to the bedside. And they would be the ones that would be the connectors. That's chaplaincy, reimagined. But it was holding the folks who were alone on both sides and bringing the two of them together in a way that they didn't think was possible until someone came up with this idea. Tahara, the ritual preparation that we use for the body in preparation for a funeral as part of the Chevra Kadisha process. We ritually wash the body. Well, you can't ritually wash a body if you're not allowed near a body, and you're not allowed to be with the other people who are supposed to help you in this holy and sacred task. So the folks at Rick Light, who is one of the folks in Kavod V'Nechum in the Gamliel Institute, came up with this idea of Tahara Ruchanit, a virtual Tahara, where the person who was there, the mate, the person who died, is there in the room. And although we are physically in our own spaces, we actually would pour libations and sing psalms using Zoom as a way to create the mystical space. One of the other great things that came out of this, as Rick and I continued to talk and push on his essay and the ideas, is now that we're in a place where we can do the Tahara in real physical time nowadays, well, the other thing that happens is, in my line of work, in end-of-life care, I often find people, as they're unpacking and sharing with me, the lament, my God, I can't bear to see my dad. I can't bear to picture him in that room in the dark, all by himself. It's so cold in there. You know, we're still continuing to understand this person as a living, breathing human being, which it's sad and it's beautiful at the same time. But what Rick and I started talking about was this idea of Zoom in the Tahara room can also be applied to the shomer, to the person who's supposed to be watching the body. So if you are a person who at 2 o'clock in the morning before the funeral, you're up pacing because you're overcome with emotion, how much comfort do you think you could derive if you could click on your computer screen and be able to view your father or your other loved one lying in repose, a candle lighting them, someone who cares for them reciting psalms at their side? It becomes an opportunity for us to reimagine how we can be present. So Zoom, for all of the Zoom fatigue that we have experienced, Zoom has actually become quite a boom. And when you think about Zoom in terms of virtual grief, the folks that want to be at a funeral but can't because they're thousands of miles away and the funeral can't be detained or delayed for that long, well, they can be there. We no longer have to worry about geography separating us. We just have to worry about time zones separating us. And those are much easier to manage. Also think about the folks that wanted to be saying Kaddish, but can't physically get to the synagogue. They can say Kaddish from home. And I'm not talking about the folks who are struggling with COVID. I'm talking about the homebound. The folks who have been denied access to our synagogues and our other places because they physically they're no longer ambulatory. This thing has actually created an incredible opportunity for us to be there in wonderful, wonderful ways and bring a level of inclusivity, which is amazing. So Tisha B'Av accomplishes a few things. We talk about renewing us as in our days of old. Elecha v'neshuvah chadash yameinu kekedem. I'd like to think of that as that return from exile. I'd like to suggest to you that this is really on an aspirational level, from a psycho-spiritual level, what Tisha B'Av is truly all about. It gives us a chance to express grief over loss. It gives us a chance to remember the destruction and those that were left behind. In this case, over 600,000 of our fellow citizens died because of COVID. Millions were struck by COVID, some of whom are permanently impaired. We understand the destruction. It gives us a humility. It gives us a sense of perspective. It gives us a sense that it's not just a blind return to normalcy, whatever that might mean. It's actually a reminder of who we are. It's a reminder of our fundamental humanity. It's a reminder of our Jewishness. When God himself realized it's not good for man to be alone, that was one of the core pieces of Jewish wisdom that's found in the book of Exodus, of course, Genesis, during the actual creation of man and woman. And this idea that we are human, we are Jewish, we also need to remember what's important. What is important in our lives? What is it that carries us forward? What is it that we aspire to? By being willing to embrace that, as in every time that we exist in a mourning space, whether it's individual mourning or in this case, corporate mourning, how do we return? For our friends who are struggling in Surfside right now, how do we help them to move forward? How do they grieve in this space, mourn the loss of their loved ones who were so radically and quickly stripped away from them in such a horrible catastrophe? And how do they come back to a place of wholeness? We don't deny. For those of us who believe that the grief process is a way of putting it behind us and forgetting, that's not what Tisha B'Av or any of our mourning practices is about. It's about learning how to live with the experience, understand that that is part of who we now are. And using that, we move forward in a wiser, more sensitive kind of a way.
Lama lanetzach tishkacheinu, tazveinu liorech yamim, hashiveinu Hashem elecha v'nashuva, chadesh yameinu kekedem, ki imaos me'astanu, katzavta aleinu ad me'od, hashiveinu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, chadesh yameinu kekedem.
That's the end of Lamentations. Renew us, renew our days as of old. Again, it's a return, but it's not a return to normal. Because I'll submit to you that what we're experiencing right now is certainly different, but we're not returning to normal because we were never there. So you can't go back to a place you never were. And indeed, even if we were to return to Jerusalem, which arguably we haven't done it in the way that the prophets envisioned. We haven't done it in the way that our original texts were imagining it to be. We've come back to a new place and a glorifying, beautiful place, a different place, however. So whether you believe in the construction of the third temple or not, the fact that Jerusalem is a living, breathing part of the experiment that is the state of Israel is extraordinary. And it's different. And we've learned from the loss. Hopefully we've learned from the loss. And hopefully we've learned from the pain and the suffering on all sides that there can be a better way. A way forward where Jerusalem, and here's the return to exile part, that Jerusalem is truly a city of peace, where it can be a light unto the world for all people, a place of refuge for all seeking peace. We're still working on it, but we're working on it now in a way which is more sensitive and benefiting from the vast wisdom of the time that we've spent in the struggle since 70 AD. I want to take a couple of minutes. I think we have a couple of minutes. So I'd like to, we're not going to break into groups or anything, but I want to see if perhaps I can leave you with something here that gives you a chance to use this understanding of Tisha B'Av and then figure out how does it apply to me now? What's valid about it in terms of a wisdom going forward? So I will ask each of you to ponder the three questions that are here. For starters, what's the hardest part of the pandemic for you? What was the thing that was most difficult about this? Each of you are probably going to have different answers. There are going to be a lot of similar answers. And I'm going to guess that they're going to run along some pretty common themes. But each of us can identify the hardest part of the pandemic, what we were deprived of, what we missed the most. What was the hardest part of waking up on a day when you couldn't figure out if it was Monday, Thursday, or maybe the Sunday from last week? It was impossible to really, everything became a blur. People that we wanted to be with, we couldn't be with. Things that we normally would do, we couldn't do. So the question that comes from that is, what did you learn from that experience, from that element of deprivation? Insights, perspectives, perhaps even some wisdom. What is it that you come away with saying, I didn't realize this before. I didn't know this before. I didn't appreciate that or them before. And finally, and I think most importantly, what will you do as a result of this knowledge? If you've identified something which is truly important that you could not do during the pandemic, and you understand how central it is to your being and to your well-being, are you going to figure out how that becomes center stage? So I think you're seeing it in terms of broad brush. You're seeing that in people talking about a move out of cities into more suburban environments. You're seeing people talking about working at home instead of commuting to an office and finding themselves distracted or extracted from the family life. You're seeing people with an understanding that family life has an element of importance that they maybe didn't fully appreciate. Question is now, how do you manage whatever that is, whatever that thing is? What are you going to do about it? And if we've learned, we can make our lives better as a result. And I think that that is essentially the core message about Tisha B'Av. It's about the Jewish wisdom that's going to help lift everyone from the pandemic. And that's the key to Tisha B'Av. If I were to say, what does Tisha B'Av have to do with life in general, not just Jewish life, life in general, American life, it's precisely this. We have this fundamental, brilliant idea that we can learn from this horrible thing and process it in a way that makes us better going forward. We can own our grief. We don't have to deny our grief. We can move forward together. We can figure out the things that are important and then begin to structure our lives and maybe even perhaps culture and society in general in a way that lifts everybody up. We can join with others, acknowledging the losses we've suffered. We can learn from the pain. And for us, we can recommit ourselves to the core values of Judaism and life, which essentially are God, family, friendship, and tikkun olam, making the world a better place for all of us. That's our mission here. And I think that's the lesson of Tisha B'Av. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and open it up to questions if there might be some.
Thank you so much, Rabbi David. Let's stop the share so that we could see your face and that folks can either use the raise hand function, or if you want to put your comment or question in the chat box. I see a few comments just came in. While folks are thinking about what they might like to share or ask, someone did ask if there was a way to contact you, if you have a contact page on a website, if you wanted to share that. Or
Sure, absolutely. Well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put in. Okay, that's my email address. You can reach me on my site, which is Jewish Relationships Initiative, but certainly reach out to me directly to have any kind of a conversation. I enjoy that. I'd enjoy that. That's basically what I do. I get to have these conversations.
Thank you so much. And I see Lynn has a hand. I'll just read a comment from Beth, and then Lynn will get you unmuted. Beth says, I learned that physical presence is essential. I'm grateful for Zoom, but we need to be together. How I ached to hug my family and how I sobbed when I finally could.
Yeah, Beth, you are so spot on. That was one of the, as a chaplain, by the way, and I work in disaster spiritual care for the Red Cross as a volunteer. I run the region for that. The hardest thing about being a chaplain is not being able to put your arms around somebody who needs a hug. Not only do they get sustenance from it, but we get sustenance from it. And the ability or the denial of holding your loved one. So many people just got a chance to see their grandchildren for the first time. And the idea of not being able to be present along that way during that time, it's really disheartening. The good news is that people like you who understand and appreciate how important physical contact is, you're going to make it your business to be able to be in places to hold people that you love. And even people you don't love, you know what, taking their hand, offering friendship in a way that expresses physically an opportunity to be with people who care and feel similarly. It's one of the great gifts that we have. It's truly one of the great gifts that we have. So I applaud you for being willing to share your vulnerability. And I just hope that we all can take a lesson from how important that is and make sure that we do reach out and hold the people that we value.
Lynn?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Yeah, I saw that about the physical exactly the same time I raised my hand, because I lost my sister this year, and it was the height of the pandemic. She was my only sibling, and she was only in her late 50s. And we tried to do some of these things, like figure out how to do a virtual, like get somebody to be the shomer, and somebody broke rules to do the ritual washing, but at the funeral, everything was just really so painful, and I haven't really been able to grieve. And then I just lost last week one of my best friends. I didn't know he was sick for 2 years, and his death he's only 59, and it's come to such a shock that I don't even know how to cope with it right now. And then there are more people. Those are just two of what I've lost in this time. And I've been looking for in-person grief support groups, and so far there are none. I live near DC, so the capital of the country, there's not one in grief in person, even though, movie theaters and bars and just about everything is open now if you're vaccinated. So and then I listened to something on NPR right before this that said that the amount of people that are dying for overdoses and addiction is so out of control now, and they know that isolation is the opposite of addiction. But yet again, I don't see like people pushing to have in-person, even rehabs that much of the like the day treatment and stuff. So I just don't understand what's going on, why the world is opening up more in some directions, but when it comes to getting emotional support, supposedly Zoom is good enough, and therapy, etc. I just don't understand.
Oh, I think, you raise a very important point. And one of the things that I think we have to do as a society is put a greater emphasis on mental health and well-being, that being able to find space to have these conversations is really important. And by the way, that NPR piece that you saw, it was a 30% increase in deaths. It was the number that I recall. And a lot of it was attributed, the writer said that a lot of it was attributed to the fact that the support groups had been taken away because people couldn't physically be with each other. And a lot of these people who were struggling with addiction were surviving based on daily trips to the 12-step program. And when those things got ripped away, the support mechanism that they had was gone. And that's a great tragedy. I think that I think we can do a better job. I think we have to do a better job. I think that this is one of the places where we can lead the way. And I think, just my own personal plug for what it means to be in a community, I think that every synagogue should be out there offering this kind of an opportunity for folks to unpack. We seem to have a real shortage of mental health professionals to service the amount of people who are actually willing at this point to admit that they're struggling. So if we actually took them plus the people who aren't willing to admit yet, we'd be completely overwhelmed in the system. And that's just not right. It's just not right. And I spend a lot of my time in that space nowadays. This past year, I continue to do it. I expect I will, because that's what we need. So I hear you loud and clear. Continue to advocate for it because you've got firsthand experience.
We have a hand from Jack, and I'll also read a comment from Mary Ann, who says she's so thankful for the time the pandemic has provided. I have finally begun my conversion to Judaism at age 70.
Better late than never. Welcome to the club.
Go ahead, Jack. Oh, Jack?
Did we lose Jack?
There. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I apologize. I'm calling from Canada, and our borders are closed with your country. So it's hard to even hard to speak across the border. Actually, I didn't unmute properly. First of all, what was very important to me and to many of the people I know was being connected. This goes to what Lena was mentioning earlier, being connected to our synagogue. In our case, our synagogue is Holy Blossom Temple, which is in Toronto. It didn't used to be a Chinese food restaurant. It's actually called Holy Blossom Temple. And I'm a volunteer. I'm also a social worker, but we made a concerted effort to stay connected to people, even though it was very difficult and challenging. So we did a couple of things. One is we have a bereavement group that runs every week of the year, once a week. And anyone is welcome, including anyone on this conference today, to come in and discuss. Everyone's welcome. And the other thing we did was, just so you'll know, as far as connection is concerned, I stole this idea from a colleague in Seattle, is we have a daily happy hour, except the rabbi wouldn't let me call it happy hour for fear of promoting drinking, which, so we call it instead l'chaim, which still promotes drinking. And we meet every day of the week at 5 o'clock, right before mincha or Maariv. And we're a Reform shul, by the way, but we have mincha and shacharit every day. But we have 25 to 30 people every day. We talk about news of the day, we talk about the pandemic, but then often we have programs on very useful Jewish subjects. So it's formed friendship. And if I may add one more thing, Rabbi, if you don't mind.
Please.
There's a rabbi colleague of yours in Montreal when it comes to Zoom, and we all have to figure out what to do with Zoom, who now calls her synagogue the Temple of Zoom. And we have to figure out how to give up some of this, but also how to reconnect with one another. We're not, by the way, in Canada, we are very cautious. We are not where you are in the United States. We're still afraid to go out. So even though many of us are vaccinated, just the way it is.
It's actually quite an issue. A friend of mine just lost his nephew, and he's Canadian, but he's unfortunately went on vacation the day before to Knoxville, Tennessee, and left all of his papers here in Philadelphia. And even if he could, by the time the quarantining was done, he couldn't get there in time. So the good news, such as it is that Zoom gave him the chance, or will give him the chance, to attend the funeral, which it's a distant second. But I will also tell you that Holy Blossom, a dear colleague of mine, a friend, Jordan Helfman, is one of the rabbis there, as I recall, and Rabbi Helfman and I went to Siberia together, our first year of rabbinical school, to bring Pesach to folks in the former Soviet Union. You've got a very special man in the clergy. But I think, by the way, I think a lot of our clergy is as dedicated, maybe not quite as talented as Jordan, but certainly dedicated. The fact of the matter is that our leadership needs the help of the lay leadership.
Absolutely.
You as a volunteer are in many ways as important as anybody else there, including clergy. And that's part of it. You know, we often tend to step up and point a finger and say, well, you really should be doing ... And it's really, you know, Rabbi, I got this great idea. Do you mind if I run with it? Because there are only so many hours in the day. And when we know that we've got people who are interested in investing in it, it makes it easier to take the risk of investing the time to create a program that may or may not work. You never know until you try it. But it's because of people like you that do that. So thank you.
If I may add, I very much admire the fact that you're holding this program today. It's really crucial, and I don't know what would be involved in holding this more frequently, Rabbi, but it's extraordinarily useful.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of My Jewish Learning, and the opportunity to be here is an honor.